If you've been hanging around feminist circles in the past few decades, you've probably heard a popular critique that goes like, "Don't write your female character as a man in a dress." The idea being that female characters in action movies are what, several decades ago, would have been men, and that recently, for feminist points, writers have been making these male characters women when the wise feminist critic can tell that they're inauthentically female and represent an insult to actual women. Often, transphobic language is thrown around about drag performances, usually the phrase "man in a dress" spat out in disgust. And the general discussion of feminist critics recognizing this trope being used sounds a lot like TERFs discussing how to identify trans people. In her 2011 video, True Grit, Maddie Ross and Feminism, Anita Sarkeesian dismisses Maddie Ross from the 2010 True Grit remake, The Bride from 2003 and 2004's Kill Bill, Volumes 1 and 2, Hit Girl from 2010's Kick-Ass, and Starbuck from the 2004 to 2009 Battlestar Galactica reboot as feminist characters because they fulfill masculine archetypes.
I've been a little dismayed by some mainstream media articles and some blog posts that are quick to label Maddie a feminist character. Personally, I think it's a bit of a leap. While it's certainly true that Maddie possesses a number of admirable traits rarely seen in female movie roles, I'm just not convinced that she's a feminist character. At no point in the film do we see a real range of emotion, such as sorrow, despair, or grief for the loss of her father. Even after she kills Cheney, she still shows no emotion. Since we live in a male-dominated, male-centered society, traits stereotypically identified as masculine are more valued, and consequently more celebrated by Hollywood, while traits stereotypically identified as feminine are undervalued and often denigrated. This may be one of the reasons why people are quick to adopt Maddie as a feminist character and other female pop culture characters who are considered strong and tough. The feminism I subscribe to and work for involves more than women and our fictional representations simply acting like men, or unquestioningly replicating archetypal male values such as being emotionally inexpressive, the need for domination and competition, and using violence as a form of conflict resolution. In my feminist vision, part of what makes a character feminist is watching her struggle with prioritizing values such as cooperation, empathy, compassion, and nonviolent conflict resolution in a world largely hostile to those values.
This basic critique is often seen in feminist spaces. A quick Google search for the string "writing feminist characters" brings up a 2016 article on the New York book editor site, Your Guide to Writing Women, which dismisses both the damsel in distress stereotype and its inverse, an aggressive, hyper-capable woman. It states, "You can create a strong woman, but make sure she's a woman, and not just a dude with a skirt on. In other words, she can't be you in drag. She's got to have the heart and motivation of a woman in every scene she's in." The first sentence, about the dude with a skirt on, is emphasized with a separate heading ready to be tweeted out as an insightful line. No dudes in skirts allowed. For years, whenever I heard this critique, it sounded wrong to me. After all, sometimes women are butch and do things that would typically be considered the realm of men. Women even wearing pants was controversial at one point, and it seemed to me that it was unfeminist to criticize the depiction of women doing traditionally masculine things like fighting. However, feminists were asserting it so confidently that I just shrugged and accepted it because it seemed like wiser women than I knew it to be true. Then, a few years ago, I went to a writing panel at the feminist-themed Geek Girl Con in Seattle, and it was actually challenged. A cishet feminist writer went through the usual "don't write your female character as a man in a dress," and one of her fellow panelists, a cis lesbian with trans friends, objected. She groaned and complained about this critique being reductive and carrying homophobic and transphobic rhetoric that hurts her and her friends into mainstream feminism. The first woman was shocked. I got the sense that she never heard anyone challenge this basic facet of feminist critique, and she disagreed, but wasn't willing to say so. After all, it would be uncouth to directly argue with someone who had more points of oppression than her, so she kept her mouth shut and let the other person talk. Until the next writing panel I saw her in that the lesbian did not attend. She brought up the same point again. Don't write a woman as a man in a dress, without the slightest injection of nuance about recently hearing a critique of that as potentially homophobic and transphobic. Everyone nodded because they were familiar with that too, and she nodded and moved on, apparently convinced that because all her fellow cishet feminists saw nothing wrong with it, that it was accurate. I have no doubt that all of those women went on to restate the rule to other people. Don't write a woman as a man in a dress, we can always tell. I don't want to demonize this woman because social pressures to conformity in feminism are immense. It took a long time for me to digest what I observed and determine that it was problematic to dismiss the concerns of that lesbian. We're told again and again to listen to women, and that includes feminists who preach about sexism to other feminists. The lesbian who spoke out was someone to listen to when she was present, but she was also going against stadiums of other women saying the other thing, each considered important to listen to. In the moment, it seems reasonable to listen to the many other women over the outlier, especially since the group could very likely be aggressive about it, and no one wants to be the outlier taking flack. However, this nod at me is an injustice done against that lesbian who spoke out in an honest effort to help her and her friends against oppression. I decided to research the critique and determine if it ever had any merit. The results were interesting. It started as sexism, with men yelling about women not being sexy enough, making them feel insecure. Then there was something like reasonable feminist criticism, and then TERFs embraced it as a means of demonizing trans men. It might have some value in discussion of performances of gender in pop culture, but it's rarely framed in a useful way. In his review of 1982's Conan the Barbarian, male film critic F.X. Feeney tore into the depiction of Valeria as a warrior woman by calling her a man.
Conan shows a world where there are two kinds of men, one of which has long hair and gorgeous tits.
Feeney's a butt.
While Valeria's sexy demeanor while doing the warrior routine is pulp silliness, the characterization of her as really a man holds a reductive view of gender roles. Women can be warriors if they want to, and sometimes were back in the day. Armor can be made for women. Women can defend people with weapons. It doesn't make them men with tits. We start to see the recognizable feminist critique with responses to the 1991 film Thelma and Louise. It received heavy criticism from male and female critics alike, who often characterized its leads as really men. Male critics usually evoked the image of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid dressed as women, while female critics described the female leads as women playing male roles. Film critic Margaret Carlson wrote,
"They become free, but only wildly, self-destructively so, free to drive off the ends of the earth. They are also free to behave like, well, men. For all the talk that Thelma and Louise is the first major female buddy movie, it is more like a male buddy movie with two women plunked down in the starring roles. Thelma and Louise act out a male fantasy of life on the road, avoiding intimacy with loud music, wild turkey, fast driving, and a gun in the pants."
What I find notable about this characterization is that while the critics understand androgyny, they deem it inauthentic to binary gender performances, rather than a sign that the film is queer. The notion that Thelma and Louise could be bi women behaving in a butch fashion, as many queer analyses speculate, totally escapes them. The idea that butch women exist at all seemingly escapes them. Louise is effectively butch, engaged in masculine modes of expression like smoking, wearing t-shirts, and shooting a gun, and she uses this to assume a protective role over the traditionally feminine Thelma. It may read as inauthentic drag performance to cishet viewers, but reads as lesbian to queer viewers when two women in this butch-femme dynamic reject their male partners and go off together when running from the law. They grow closer, kiss, and die together. It represents a portrayal of bisexual women queering gender performance. Infamous TERF Germaine Greer, who has made extensive contributions to transphobic rhetoric, wrote about this popular criticism of female characters acting like men in her 1999 book, The Whole Woman, and basically transformed a complaint by men that butch female characters weren't womanly enough into a feminist complaint about gender essentialism and trans people. She took existing transphobic rhetoric calling action-oriented female characters women dressing as men and spun it to demonize trans men transitioning from the female gender role to the masculine by referencing trans women as figures of disgust. As described in The Whole Woman, Greer truly does not think that women should be fighters. She criticizes women's inclusion in law enforcement and the military, characterizing them as quintessentially masculine social spheres that force women to behave like men and acquire the deplorable qualities of men embraced by male hierarchies. Greer writes,
As soon as a woman enters a male preserve, be it the police, the military, the building site, the law, the clergy, she finds herself in an alien and repellent world which changes her fundamentally, even as she is struggling to exert the smallest influence on it. As these masculine realms have been constructed to withstand outsiders and have grown stronger and more effective in doing so over many generations, they are virtually incapable of transformation.
In Greer's worldview, there can never be a good representation of a female fighter, only a woman pretending to be a man to be accepted by patriarchy, which is how she views trans men. The Whole Woman is filled with vitriol for trans and intersex people, going as far as to compare trans women being allowed to transition to Norman Bates, the demonized trans woman villain of Psycho, as a man murdering his mother, and in reversal of the plot, getting away with it. In the 2018 TERF vs. trans activist debate Genderquake, Greer would accuse intersex woman Castor Semenya, assigned female at birth, raised as a woman, but having XY chromosomes, giving her elevated testosterone that gives her an edge in athletic competition, of not being a real woman. She goes on to say, in reference to trans women,
being without a penis doesn't make you a woman.
No one's saying that it is.
Any more than being without a womb makes you a man.
Notice how extreme the essentializing is here. A woman with a whole life, reduced to chromosomes that didn't even affect her lifelong development. Greer can't see any further than 2 letters of the alphabet. This is the context of Greer's framing of the female action hero as not a real woman, just a man in a dress. Transphobic, interphobic hatred. When she calls Lara Croft a sergeant major with balloons stuffed up his shirt, sexually ambiguous, and not a real woman, it stems from hatred of anyone who steps outside traditional notions of femininity and masculinity. She derides female fighters as women who try to succeed in masculine realms, describes them as having transformed into the enemy, men, and then denigrates the resultant men as trans women. It is vile misogyny, unbefitting feminist film criticism. Following Greer's writing, other TERFs repeated this idea that women are in danger of turning into men. In her 2005 book, Female Chauvinist Pigs, Ariel Levy criticized women who embrace cultural values featuring women as objects of lust with the broad term female chauvinist pigs. This term encompasses female sex workers, women who consume pornography, lesbians who lust after women, teen girls who have sex with teen boys for social reasons instead of their own lust, and women who embrace traditional signifiers of masculinity. Levy characterizes them all as women capitulating to the patriarchy, and she particularly hates on the latter. She first criticizes Judith Regan for bragging about having the biggest cock in the building and calling people pussies, like a male chauvinist, compares women like this to Uncle Toms, and goes on to demonize trans men as the extreme version of women embracing masculinity. Describing various instances of lesbians embracing masculine casual attitudes about sex, she starts describing an overheard conversation between 2 trans men. Misgendered, treated as a horrifying example of how masculinized lesbian culture has become. Levy describes the main trans man as
a girl in a newsboy cap and a white t-shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Her chest was smooth and flat. She'd either had top surgery, a double mastectomy, or, more likely, she bound her breasts down, to achieve the look.
Levy cites every detail of masculine social expression as a sign of lesbian depravity, apparently ignorant of the two guys even being trans. The whole scene is framed as an example of two women who hate women. She goes on to explicitly hate on trans people, when she can recognize them, first describing in horror how the queer anarchist Dumba Collective replaced its gendered restrooms with a trans-inclusive reclaimed trannies label, and going on to condemn trans men and assigned female at birth, non-binary trans people as a phenomenon. Levy writes,
"The transformation of women to men is so prevalent within the scene they have a name for it: butch flight. This is to say that women who don't feel the traditional definition of femininity fits them, who in another lesbian era would have considered themselves butch, are more and more frequently thinking of themselves as transsexual, and doing whatever they can to actualize that self-conception medically."
She brings the trans phenomenon back to sexual promiscuity, suggesting that women embrace masculine gender performance so that they can have a lot of sex with no strings attached, posting numerous examples of butch women lusting after femme women in a way evocative of Levy's female chauvinist pig. Ultimately, she files being trans under women hating themselves and being problematically masculinized, similar to Greer's writings. This is the context for Anita Sarkeesian's condemnation of female action heroes in 2011, saying that they're not feminist characters because they're women taking the roles of men. 6 videos before that, she cites female chauvinist pigs uncritically as a source of feminist wisdom.
Ariel Levy describes in her fantastic book Female Chauvinist Pigs how women are being trained to be just as raunchy and objectify other women just like one of the guys.
This would also have been the background for every feminist of the time who wrote opinion articles on writing female characters. I don't know who coined the snappy "don't write a man in a dress" phrase, but it came out of the same transphobic condemnation of butch women by evoking a disgust of trans women and gained traction because of it. Anyone these days who seriously says to not write a woman as a man in a dress should seriously examine their beliefs for TERF sentiment. This line should not be allowed in modern trans-inclusive feminism. And here comes the Twilight Zone twist. The criticism is actually relevant. It got spearheaded by TERFs and manifested in a transphobic way, but is worth recovering. When second-wave feminism surged in the 60s and 70s and 80s media saw a rejection of regressive feminine stereotypes of demure, helpless women, and started exploring the possibility of assertive, capable women, but it did so very clunkily, haphazardly giving them masculine traits, a trend that continued through the years. Female empowerment was explored through the concept of women rejecting the feminine gender role associated with demure helplessness and instead being taught masculine capability by a male role model. In the 2009 TV series Dollhouse, one episode's protagonist is an athletic woman proficient in firearms.
You know how to use this?
4 brothers. None of them Democrats.
It's a snappy way to allow the audience to accept her proficiency and something associated with the male gender role, even in a show written to be progressive, in an episode climax about a woman subverting sexist assumptions and defeating a predatory man stalking her. It sums up how mainstream media frequently addresses female empowerment through the assumption of traits gendered masculine. Mainstream films in the 80s and 90s often elevated women through having a strong man guide them into competency through the rejection of femininity. The 1984 film Romancing the Stone, then considered a feminist riff on 1981's Raiders of the Lost Ark, effectively illustrates this concept. When the male love interest grows frustrated with the female protagonist, struggling through the jungle in heels, he violently takes her shoes away and cuts off the heels with a machete. This is framed as a moment of growth, where she puts aside her weakness, associated with femininity, and ascends to a state of power through coerced masculinity. By the end of the film, she can take down a villain with masculine aggression and competency that surprises her sister. She has changed so much. It's feminist for the time because, unlike in Raiders, she's not wholly dependent on a man to save her, but is still fundamentally misogynistic. Ripples of this can be seen in modern films. In the 2015 film Jurassic World, a similar dynamic exists between the female lead and her hyper-competent male love interest who guides her through the jungle and leads her to reject feminine weakness. Originally, he was going to force her to remove her heels, but actress Bryce Dallas Howard insisted her character be allowed heels as a feminine strength, leading to a bit of incoherence where her shoes are highlighted as impractical. Nothing is done about this, and she later runs from a T-Rex in impractical heels.
You'll last 2 minutes in there. Less in those ridiculous shoes.
You gonna respond to that? No? Okay. Meanwhile, the 2022 film The Lost City parodies the scene with the male love interest being a himbo, accurately noting her heels are unsuitable for the jungle, and then providing another set of impractical shoes. It tries to be a more feminist version of Romancing the Stone, but ultimately fails to address the misogyny at the heart of the original scene. This rejection of femininity merges with the sexy female action star figure in 1996's The Long Kiss Goodnight. The protagonist starts out as an amnesiac woman named Samantha, living a traditionally feminine life as a mother and homemaker, but she falls into conflict with her original personality, a badass spy, with the androgynous named Charlie, who is trained to be a secret agent by her father. Charlie dominates the film until her maternal instincts push her to find a balance with her traditionally feminine persona. This was reasonably feminist at the time, but represents social tension with competing gender roles. We see this develop with various strong women defying gender norms, entering traditionally male spaces, and being traditionally sexy as they do so. A 1998 Jim Beam print ad illustrates this concept with a hot woman embodying traditional femininity, positioned like she's performing oral sex on a man, yet endued with a superficial masculine performance in her tank top, drinking milk straight from the carton, and drinking the traditionally masculine Jim Beam. A caption urges women, get in touch with your masculine side. Just enough to buy their product, not enough to limit their desirability in the eyes of traditionally masculine men.
You don't have to worry, Major. I played with dolls when I was a kid.
This is how the female action star develops. With the note that the Wachowskis are both trans, and 1999's The Matrix is dripping with trans symbolism, Trinity is still a sexy female action star in a traditional male space.
I just thought, you were a guy.
Most guys do.
Trans symbolism, yes. Also, to the mainstream, a sexy female action star pushing gender norms just enough to be loosely feminist without being unattractive. Then, of course, there's 2001's Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, which offended Greer and made her break out the man-in-a-dress characterization. Celine in 2003's Underworld follows Trinity, and then Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2 in 2003 and 2004, which offended Anita Sarkeesian, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith in 2005 solidified the popularity of the sexy female action star. Feminine enough to be hot, masculine enough to be the cool girlfriend every man wants. The TERFs led the feminist criticism of these characters with, these characters aren't real women, they're men in dresses, in the context of their extensive bibliography on why quote-unquote men in dresses, i.e. trans women, must be morally mandated out of existence. In context of this transphobia, they made the assertion that these characters are not feminist characters, and you should never write a woman as a man in a dress. However, there is a decent point here underneath the transphobia. These characters aren't particularly realistic, designed as they are for the male gaze. Someone who devotes themselves to physical activity as a warrior might clean up nice for a fancy event, but they aren't going to have the figure of a sex symbol. Carrying the Romancing the Stone, rejection of femininity into these figures is ultimately just misogynistic. Don't write a man in a dress is a horrible way to express this sentiment, but an appreciation of the feminine world and what leads a woman to seek out these kinds of traditionally masculine roles that is centered on the female characters themselves and not strong men guiding them into masculine strength is important for writing respectful, strong female characters. Another side to Don't Write a Man in a Dress is the way that sometimes strong female characters are initially written as men or genderless. 1979's Alien is the main example of this. Initially, the script was plotted with characters referred to only by their last names, with an understanding that gender would be filled in later to broaden the characters. Hence, we have Ripley as a strong female character in a long-running action horror series. Ripley has been subject to both an example of a man in a dress not to write, and a shining example of the kind of gender norm subverting female protagonist you can get when you change the genders late in development. The idea that a writer can counter sexist biases by initially writing all the characters as men is popular in feminist circles. I've been to multiple feminist writing panels that offer that as a quick and dirty way to write a strong female character. Sometimes they'll even list that advice alongside "don't write a man in a dress," because both ideas are popular in feminism. Though it shouldn't be the end of what a writer can do to make a female character not be sexist. Ripley was developed as a female character with a love interest even after her role in the plot was determined genderless. I personally don't see any problem with it if a writer needs that cheat code to circumvent internalized sexism. Notably, Buffy Summers, of the 1997 to 2003 TV series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, was developed as a self-insert of creator Joss Whedon. In his biography, he describes finding success out of college through the niche of what he calls literary transvestism, projecting himself into female characters and writing their success stories as translated aspirational stories of himself as an underdog. Biography writer Amy Pascal writes, Joss Whedon's interest in feminism meshed with the development of Joss's voice as a writer, which he describes as that of a literary transvestite. He was no longer just interested in female characters, he actually needed to use them as his avatars. His excitement at a young age at seeing a girl character led into the club had grown into a desire to tell her story himself, because it was a story he himself wanted to live. Somebody who appears to be or is weak becoming stronger, but in almost every case, that person is female. Though Whedon himself has been revealed as a deplorable person, Buffy is one of the most feminist sexy female action stars out there. She is a bit dated, representing some turfy gender studies classes that Whedon took in the 80s, and nothing more recent, but is reasonably effective in her historical context.
If the apocalypse comes, beat me.
Character creation is complicated. None of these simplistic directives are comprehensive. They're general criticisms condensed into what appear to be easy rules. However, at the end of the day, there aren't easy rules for this kind of thing. Just approach the subject with appropriate levels of nuance. Take these criticisms under advisement, but don't be too restricted by quick, snappy phrases that remove nuance. Don't let your desire for an easy set of rules overpower your skepticism. The people who make these rules have an agenda, and it may not be one you agree with if you scrutinize it enough. I say, if you're a good enough writer to effectively translate a masculine personality to the feminine sphere without disrespecting femininity in the process, go for it. It's not guaranteed to be effective, but if you can use it as a jumping off point to writing a nuanced character, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. Literary transvestism and subverting gender norms might be a feminist route after all. Man in a dress, women dressed as men, go for it. Queer it up. Thank you all for watching. Please share this video whenever you see a feminist saying, "Don't write a woman as a man in a dress," especially if they don't think they're a TERF. Like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell to stick it to a TERF.